All right, my name is Stephen Popper. I'm from the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica. I was invited to give a presentation for this series. Oh, muchas gracias. As many of you know, I was supposed to do this morning, but there were severe problems with my flight. I didn't land in Monterrey until, just about 2 hours ago. And I'm very pleased to be at Tecnológico de Monterrey. I was telling people earlier that for a dozen years or so I've been aware of tech and the excellence of this institution, and had been very eager to have the opportunity to come and visit. I also was made aware of the specialties of the cuisine of Nuevo León, and that too was a very powerful pull for me. Here's what I'm going to do. I had been asked to present a 45-minute presentation. It was going to be a very ambitious 45 minutes. Now I've been asked to do something more along the lines of 20 minutes. So let me give you an outline of what I want to do. What I want to do is I want to set the table. I want to put some ideas out for our discussion. And what I am probably going to do is stick with the first part of my talk, because what I want to do is I want to suggest that there is a problem that stares us in the face that we need to recognize. And this really connects with the theme of accelerating technological change. Then I will very briefly talk about a technique that we have been developing, and then I have even a shorter bit that I will put at the end. I will try very hard to do this rapidly. So without further ado, let me just go right ahead. I'm going to put together in the beginning several propositions. It would be nice if we had time and opportunity to debate them. I am just going to state them not as truths, but as propositions. The first is that as I travel around the world and I deal with democratic governments, I have a very strong perception of a quiet but nonetheless profound and general crisis in democratic institutions, namely that they are being confronted with many different challenges that they were not designed to meet, and they appear not to be doing very well. They are coming up with policies that don't seem to fit, or more often than not, just not being timely. And what is worse is, as bad as they may be at this, I think there is a growing perception among the populations whom they are designed to serve that they are not doing their job. And this sets up a potential very serious crisis of faith in democratic institutions. I'm going to talk a lot about uncertainty. I'm going to suggest that uncertainty is one of the largest contributory causes, and because of the focus that I have, I think I would also make a strong case that it is technology that adds a great deal of uncertainty, both because of the ubiquity of technology, that it seeps into all of our lives, and the fact that we are undergoing an ever-accelerating dynamic of technological change. Okay, the second proposition I'm going to talk about actually is less of a proposition, because a fellow named Herbert Simon received a Nobel Prize in economics for talking about this. And this is what I'll call uncertainty absorption. What I mean is that when you the people who are looking at the data, the people who sort of understand where the holes are, what data series they should pay attention to, which information sources are reliable, and so on, they have a very strong sense of this. But when you are trying to act within an organization, it's not information that is passed up the chain of command, it's an interpretation of that information. And therefore, much of this nuance is lost. And what was kind of a best guess now attains greater degrees of certainty the more it moves up to the decision level. So I will suggest that in view of this phenomenon, that we need, and because of the acceleration of technological change, the shortening of decision cycles and so on, we need to think about multiple uncertainties in a way that does not gum up the works, that still, allows our institutions to operate and to not be drowned in the sea of, well, it could be this, it could be that, it could be the other things. The next proposition I will put forward is that there is a two cultures problem that exists between the analytical culture, the policy analyst, and the policy community. I'm borrowing the term two cultures from Lord C.P. Snow. And here's what I mean. All of us here were kind of raised in an analytical culture, quantitative-based, numerate, reductive, getting down to the essence, systematic, and so on, rooted in good old-fashioned Cartesian deductive logic. Now you look at the policy community, and it's a different society. It's not a quantitative culture, it's a narrative culture. People tell each other stories. That's how they convince. It's very detail-oriented. It's very nuanced. It brings a lot of threads together. And it's rooted in a different logic. It's rooted in an inductive as opposed to deductive logic. The way that a decision maker earns his or her money is to ask what-if questions. Well, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if the other thing happens? They are supposed to steer their organization towards mission goals, but they also have to develop a hedged position. They have to think of various types of risk and hedge against that risk. So the question is, I will maintain that there's a mismatch between the typical sort of analytical products that we very often produce and what the policy conversation actually needs. And more than that, we need to be able to support collaborative processes that will allow groups in a ministry, among ministries, among different stakeholder groups, to come to, even though they come from very different perspectives, to come to common conclusions about decision choices and risk bearing. Now, what I'm going to talk about is more than just uncertainty. I'm going to talk about what I will call deep uncertainty. For those of you who are familiar with the work of the early 20th century economist Frank Knight, this is sometimes referred to as Knightian uncertainty. And I'm going to, at this point, talk about it as a situation where we do not know or we cannot agree on the probabilities of future states of the world, that is, say, parametric uncertainty, or the link between cause and effect. What's the underlying model? In other words, structural uncertainty. And I will go beyond deep uncertainty and add something else which probably could be better called deep controversy. But this is how to evaluate future outcomes. If we're going to talk about climate, if we're going to talk about global sustainability, how do we value future outcomes? How do we weigh economic growth versus, environmental health, right? These are questions of values that we cannot easily disregard. So here is the key. What I'm suggesting is that so much in our analysis is we're focusing on the question of what will happen. We're attempting to be predictive. We're attempting to come up with forecasts and so on. We use an inherent predict then act methodology that's rooted in the theory of utility maximization in the presence of risk. And I'm going to suggest that this is very curious because what we really want to know, the only reason that we ask what will happen is because what we're really trying to do is to figure out, even though we're not going to believe the forecast just because somebody says this is going to happen. We will use that as an input, as an update to the problem that we're trying to work in our heads, which is what are the short-term actions that I can take today that are going to be in line with my long-term goals. Okay. I'll do this very, very quickly, but here are historical data points on the link between energy use and the size of the economy in the United States, going back to 1890 and up to 1973. This is about as linear a set of data as you would wish. Now, the extrapolation would take it out to here, but people, after the 1973 oil embargo, said, well, wait a minute, no, I mean, the game has changed fundamentally. So now you had people in around 1975 trying to develop scenarios, a best guess scenario, kind of a minimal scenario, a maximum scenario, and so on, and billions of dollars of decisions and investments were based on this. Well, this is what actually happened, starting from 1973. So in other words, all of our attempts to be predictive really was just, when you come right down to it, ways of kind of building up our confidence, reducing our fear. Really had very little to do with what actually happened. All right, I was going to go through this example of work that we had done. I thought this would be interesting in part because I know in Mexico there's, conversations about natural resource use, petroleum, interaction with the economy, and so on. I'm not going to brief this project. I'm just going to show you pictures to help you kind of get in your minds a style, an approach of conducting an analysis. I think it's very interesting to compare things. This is actually the size of Israel compared to the state of California. And this is the state of Nuevo León, compared to Israel. I don't know really what all the fuss is about. They were facing an electricity crisis. They were concerned about environment, health, economics, supply, land use. And the problem is that even though you can imagine that the choices they faced really had large implications, for 15 years they really couldn't decide about how they were going to develop the electricity sector. So we did a project where, we wanted to demonstrate this approach that I'm talking about. One of the things we did, maybe I'll have a chance to talk about this a little bit later, we find this is a very useful way of not only doing kind of an intellectual accounting of a problem like this, but also to kind of set up an experimental design, an analytical structure. And basically what we look at, when we start thinking about the uncertainties, we start listing the uncertainties and we put them under 4 different categories. There are some that are exogenous uncertainties, the future price of oil, changes in fossil fuel technology, non-fossil fuel technology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then there are levers that are actually under your control, such as changing, carbon price, controlling greenhouse gas emission levels, and so on. Now, bear in mind that this really depends on who is going to be the actor. So, for example, for the Ministry of Energy in Israel, the future interest rate, discount rate, is an uncertainty. For the Bank of Israel, that's one of the levers that they have under control. So you see that one of the things we're doing now is we're actually putting the decision maker in the analysis. We are not analyzing a system, we are analyzing a decision space. The other large categories are the relationships between factors, call it the model if you will, and then the measures of outcomes. It's very rare that you can just pick one indicator or one metric and say this is a good outcome. And if I had time, I would go through this, but you see that there are many of these that are actually working in opposite directions. Let's talk a little bit more about assumptions in planning. All plans have to make assumptions about the future, and many of them we identify clearly, but most plans also include implicit, hidden assumptions, and these are the ones that can really cause the mischief if you are not aware of them early on. The assumptions exist because of the presence of uncertainty, and I would suggest that especially if we talk about uncertainty that comes from technology and technological change, an inherently uncertain process, This is not a failure of due diligence. This is not that we didn't do our homework. This is part of the system. So now what we want to do in the presence of uncertainty is systematically identify explicit and implicit assumptions and make them part of the planning process. So now what we're doing is we're getting away from the idea of maximizing our strategy, maximize our utility, maximizing our income for a particular assumed set of assumptions, and rather look for solutions that are going to do well enough, again in the language of Herbert Simon, will be satisficing rather than maximizing across a wide range of alternative futures. So we use many scenarios to imagine the future. We seek robust strategies rather than optimal strategies. We very often employ strategies that evolve over time. And we use computers not as magical answer machines, but as tools to help human reasoning processes. In this project, we did a very detailed model of Israel's energy sector, made it very open. We didn't want it to be a black box. We looked at two different questions. One was, what was the optimal level of natural gas utilization from the standpoint of these objectives such as land use and cost and so on and so forth. And once we had that, then to ask the question, what was the supply infrastructure that would support it? Because supply security, as you might imagine, is a very large issue. So we created a database of strategic outcomes. We had our model, we varied assumptions so that we had 1,400 different futures. We came up with a very wide list of candidate strategies, most of them very stupid and simple deliberately, so that we could cover the spectrum. Eventually, we winnowed this down to 7 candidate strategies. We developed a database of about 10,000 individual cases. And then we did use data mining techniques. We looked for those that met our criteria in terms of costs, emissions, and land use, and found that there were 3 strategies that seemed like good candidates. So then we went, and again, this is a human-based system. It's intended to allow human beings to do what they do well, which is to draw inferences and ask questions, and let computers do what they do well, which is add a bunch of zeros and ones together. So we modified, once we understood where the systematic failures were for each of these strategies, we modified them. I won't go through this, but the idea is that these were rule-based strategies, not the sort of fixed plan that the Israeli government and many other governments use when they do energy planning. These are basically a set of alternative if-then statements. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this. And now we tested these modified strategies again. So I'm going to show you a very simple statistical view of the results. There were 4 strategies, the baseline strategies and the 3 candidate strategies. In terms of system cost, not too surprisingly, 99% of the cases we generated for the low-cost strategy met this criterion, 94% for the more natural gas, and only 67% for less natural gas. For emissions, the low-cost strategy and the more natural gas strategy were about equal. Land use, well, you can see that the more natural gas strategy, 97% of the cases met the minimal criteria that we had set, but would be set by policymakers. And if we ask how many meet all 3 thresholds, we discovered that the one that did it most was this more natural gas strategy. Now the question is, does this make this necessarily a robust strategy? And the answer is no. All I'm showing you is just kind of a statistical breakdown. I haven't put any weights or probabilities on the likelihood of these different cases occurring. I haven't introduced kind of the preferences or the fears of the Israeli decision makers. So let me show you another part of the analysis where we did just that. Now we're looking at the supply side, and we did the same sort of thing. There were basically four basic strategies. Just use the domestic source of natural gas, use the domestic source primarily, but also build out an LNG pipeline, do the same thing, but now rely more on the LNG and keep the domestic supply in the ground as kind of reserve. And then one where we introduced kind of a decision, a rule. If you get to a certain point and you see certain conditions in the world, then you will build out an LNG pipeline. Otherwise, you won't. And if we use the same sort of criteria that I just showed you for the other, this would be the one that seemed to meet the criteria in the greatest number of cases. But is this really true? I mean, what if there actually was an emergency and all of these different strategies that had different plans for drawing on switch fuels or switching between LNG and domestic reserves and so on and so forth? What if it actually happened? In other words, if I was a decision maker, I would worry about, my nightmare scenario. What is the case then? So we looked at 20,000 such cases and tried to ask which strategy performs best under emergency conditions. Now, I've been moving very quickly, I know, to get to this point. This is the part that I would like to spend some time on, and then, I will wrap things up very quickly. If we were doing sort of the traditional utility maximization under risk, and we wanted to know about which strategy to pursue if there actually was a cutoff. In this case, we couldn't talk about it openly, but we talked about a cutoff of the natural gas supply from Egypt to Israel. There are many uncertainties and things that you would need to make assumptions about. For example, what's the probability? Right? So it's a problem in risk bearing. Is it a 1% chance, a 10% chance, a 50% chance, a 0% chance, as the ministry insisted at the time that we did this work? How do you know? How do you pick it? And yet that number is going to have a very profound influence on what the outcome actually is. But we're not interested in the outcome. We've taken ourselves out of the business of trying to predict the future. What we're trying to do is to understand, among the choices available to us, which one is most likely to suit our long-term needs. And what you discover is that if you vary assumptions about the likelihood of a cutoff, it makes big differences in terms of what the outcome actually is. But as you look at the different choices in front of you, it shifts them up and down, but it doesn't change the relationship between them. So this is an uncertainty that we can't really estimate, that we can't easily characterize, but we can also ignore it because it turns out not to be crucial to our decision. What does turn out to be crucial upon examining these results is the ratio of cost between the liquid natural gas, pipeline, supply pipeline, largely imports, and the domestic cost. Now, again, we're not in the business of trying to figure out what the future is going to be. What we want to do is to compare among our choices. At each one of these different potential future price ratios, one of these four strategies, at least one, by definition, is going to do better than the others. It may not lead to a very nice outcome from the standpoint of the policymakers, but it will do better than the others. And therefore, in each case, we can calculate what would be our zero level of regret. That is to say, if we had chosen that strategy, we would have been pleased having done so compared to where we would be with the alternatives. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at these strategies, not in terms of the outcomes, but the level of regret associated with each one. So, for example, one of them, the ones that I called the joint domestic strategy. It does well when, the liquid natural gas prices are relatively low compared to the domestic, but the regret quickly mounts as you move out in this direction. Similarly, this one, you have relatively high regret at this stage and relatively low regret here. This one is really kind of a non-starter because it's dominated throughout the region by at least one other strategy. But the one that's really interesting is this one. If we were doing sort of a standard utility maximization exercise, if we were trying to optimize, we would not look twice at this strategy, because in each instance there is something else that does better. But it possesses a very nice property. Although, except for potentially one small region, it never is the best, it is pretty much throughout the region the second best. And when it fails relatively gracefully compared to the others that fail in those regions. So this now becomes a candidate for a robust strategy. If the decision makers really did not have any prior information and were highly risk averse about bad consequences throughout this region, this is the one that they would now look at as being a candidate robust strategy. Now, the goal of this kind of exercise is not to have a deus ex machina, spitting out answers. That's really the role of the policymakers. What we're trying to do is to help people better understand the basis upon which they should make choices, to create tools to support the human reasoning process. This now I will skip this pretty much. What I'm going to suggest is that this is not only an analytical technique, but this is a way of carrying out a prescription that the National Academy of Sciences and the National Research Council in the United States has suggested when you have deliberative bodies dealing with so-called wicked problems. And what they suggest is a process that integrates deliberation with analysis. You have stakeholders deliberate over trade-offs. They provide instructions to the analysts. The analysts address the impacts of alternative responses. They feed that back to the stakeholders for the next round of conversations. And what I and my colleagues have done is we have, in fact, been able to use this and other techniques to support precisely this sort of process. And perhaps in the discussion I can explain in a little more detail exactly what we have done. So let me just end. I'm now going to give the name that I've avoided so far. This is something that we call robust decision making. And I'm going to suggest it provides two ways of addressing the problem of deep uncertainty. Better forecasts and predictions is not one of them. I think that is like running the race of the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland. You're going to run faster and faster and faster just to stay in the same place. Instead, what you really get is the ability to enhance the robustness of proposed courses of action. And I call this kind of a modern version of Occam's razor. Just like we discovered that the big uncertainty of, is there a likelihood of a natural gas cutoff and so on, actually turns out not to be essential to the question that we're really asking. And number two, if you've paid careful attention, we're not characterizing uncertainties in terms of probabilities, because all we're going to do is just have a big fight and never get anywhere in the beginning. We're characterizing the uncertainties by the effect that they have over the alternatives that we choose among. Last slide. In many ways, what we are doing is making use of advanced computer technology to implement very old ideas, such as that of Francis Bacon, who said that if we begin with certainties, we make assumptions, we'll end in doubts. But if we begin with doubts, explore all possible assumptions, and are patient in them, we shall end uncertainties. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I know that this was a very, very difficult talk to listen to, especially in a foreign language. I admire you all for having stayed the course, and I'd be happy to, at this point, entertain any questions or discussions that you would like to have. Let me talk about some of the areas where we have been applying this type of work. A lot of work in water planning, where you're building infrastructure that's going to last for 50 or 70 years, and you don't know what future you're building for. We just recently had a seminar in Asia where we brought together 20 fellows who were discussing the problems of water inundation and sustainability in urban environments in Asia, where you don't know what the future climate is going to be, you don't know what the future demographics are going to be, you don't know what the economic trajectories are going to be, you don't know what the resource cost and core resource base and resource cost will be. So these are areas where, traditional decision-making techniques or analysis techniques have really failed to provide the support to policymakers. I have another project that I did for the Transportation Research Board in the United States, also part of the National Research Council. And they wanted to know why it is, when we have all of these technologies emerging, why is it that transportation agencies in the United States are such slow adopters of these technologies? In the United States, of course, as in keeping with our political culture, we really have 52 different state departments of transportation who make decisions, including the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. We have 350, 360 metropolitan planning organizations. And they're confronted by this problem of all of these technologies coming. And, somehow they're supposed to make decisions, on the basis of very little information. Somebody runs a trial in New Hampshire and reports on that technology, and then the Department of Transportation in Arizona is asking itself, well, how does this apply to us? We have a different climate, we have a different political situation, we have a different scale, we have different finances. So it turns out that this problem of uncertainty, in the project we were asked to actually explore why this persistent lag exists and what we could do about it. What we discover is, in fact, that these organizations just simply could not deal with the profound uncertainties. And so we actually developed a methodology that would allow them at the local level, not a really profound, highly advanced computer technique and so on and so forth, but something that could actually operate at the local level, help them think through their problem of technology assessment and technology choice. My limited experience in Mexico, and I'm just talking, hoping somebody will jump in. I've been involved in projects, whether for the World Bank or for the Distrito Federal, looking at science and technology-based economic development plans. How do you build a hub? How do you create a hot zone? How do you create an innovation center and have that actually affect the the economy of the region? These are the sort of problems that I think about, and this is sort of the reason why I found many of the things sitting in my analytical toolbox were really not adequate to address some of these questions. I open the floor to anybody who wishes to wishes to discuss. Please.
I'm Kiro Terashima from the School of Engineering, and I have a point of view more for computer science and intelligent systems. But I can imagine the size of the number of variables you have, and the different scenarios that you can provide, etc. But what kind of infrastructure? I mean, computational infrastructure you put along your methodology that you have.
Yeah. So the question is, it becomes clear that in a sufficiently complicated decision space, you have many variables, different assumptions about what the future values of those variables will be, and very quickly you've got a problem of combinations. You're not talking about 3 or 4 or a dozen or 100 different futures. You're talking about tens of thousands, if not millions, of different futures. So how do you handle this computationally? What's the infrastructure that you use? I believe that was the question, yes? Okay. So there are a number of answers to that. Certainly cloud computing is making the barriers disappear very rapidly. This is something that we've only recently been able to take advantage of. What we have done heretofore is to, use kind of intelligent computational design to design compound computational experiments that will kind of sample among these alternative future states. So use things like Latin hypercube, searches to generate databases. This is a technique that inherently allows for and gives value to low-resolution modeling. I mean, the traditional approach to developing a model, to thinking about a systems problem is, okay, we sit down and we say, okay, well, here are the boundaries of the system, here are the elements in the system, here is how we relate to them, and we develop a marvelous human artifact, a model, a very detailed model, and so on and so forth. And then we go and we get our data time series, and now we feed them into the model. And now the computer, all it is doing basically is acting like a glorified adding machine. It's going chunka, 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 and kind of working it through. And you can very easily get yourself confused by this. And now you've got this gigantic, these gigabytes of data, and what are they telling you? The essence of the way that we deal with this is to really sit down and think about what is it we're trying to achieve. And what we have discovered is that it's useful to start looking through the wrong end of the telescope. Start at the end. What are the decisions that need to be informed? What are the choices that are available? That's the starting point. Now, from that, building forward, more towards where we'd normally start things, how do we say something useful about those choices? What sort of an analytical apparatus? So we're really sort of building the model not to be, a very accurate representation of reality, but as a tailor-built artifact to address the question that we want to address. This has a number of virtues, because what you discover is that, just this sort of low-resolution modeling allows you to see that, there are indeed parts of this model that need to become more detailed, because they are very important areas for informing the decision. And there are others that, it becomes pretty clear that they're really not, there are uncertainties. It would be nice to know, yes, they're parts of the system, but they really don't change the order of preferences. So you can sort of go in iterative steps. And this is actually also very good when you are doing something for a set of decision makers, because you can listen to them, you can develop a prototype system. You can bring back, sort of the initial results, get their feedback, and then decide what you want to build out. So part of the way of dealing with the combinatorics problem is to not allow it to arise. To think through with some kind of intelligence and sophistication what really is necessary to know in order to inform this decision. And what you come up with then is a different sociology than you had previously, where analysts, academicians, and so on will do a study and so on, and they'll come up with results for the study. And then somehow the decision maker, the policy maker, need to make the intellectual leap of, well, how does this now affect the kind of discussions that we have been having? How do we now interpret this in light of the decisions that we need to make? And it really kind of sets up kind of an artificial barrier between the analytic community and the policy community, where the discussions by the policymakers sort of take place among themselves, and at a certain point, the door is shut in the face of the analysts. But if you built the analysis in the way that I described, then it feeds directly into the policy process, because you have framed it precisely you have put the policy decision inside the analysis. The analytical output feeds directly into the policy process. We definitely do come up with barriers, and had a lot of computational barriers in the past. What we're defining is that these are rapidly falling away. As a matter of fact, there's a big study that my colleagues did on the water use in the upper and lower Colorado Basin. And all of the affected states, including, I believe, Mexico, were involved, so there were a lot of stakeholders and so on. And they did this sort of deliberative process. They did these models. They came back 2 months later with the results and so on and so forth. So recently we did an experiment. We put all of the models and analysis on the supercomputers at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and in one day brought in stakeholders and basically reproduced that process now in real time. They would have a discussion and so on and so forth, break for coffee, come back, in 20 minutes, and there would be analytical results. So it's a problem, it exists, but it's being worked a number of ways, both through, computer science and really kind of new approaches to modeling. That was a long-winded answer, but it was a good question. Any other? Yes, please.
Right now I can see that this is a very complex regression analysis. The traditional regression analysis, but what do you forecast about the use of this technique in comparison with the traditional regression analysis overall in the policymakers, because this is collecting, I see that this is like collecting quality input variables, thousands of variables instead, rather than choosing just the traditional model from growth or from development.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your forecast about the use of this technique?
So the question is, this seems like that there's a lot of complication, a lot of sophistication, you're using new approaches and so on and so forth. How does that now sit with people, in government and so on and so forth? How well do they accept it, as opposed to using kind of, more traditional approaches that, may not be as impressive or sophisticated, but, people are familiar with and so on? Is that the essence of the question? Okay, once again, a very good question, and there are a number of answers to it. First off, it's important to note that this is not a new approach to modeling. It's a different philosophy for the use of models. Basically, it's suggesting that models have been misused previously. People have used them as predictive engines, for which they are, outside of the physics laboratory or an aerospace facility, engineering facility or so on, they're not very well suited for that. Which doesn't suggest you get rid of the models. What it suggests is that, because they're very often really well done. I mean, serious people, devoted people, putting in a lot of time to develop these models. What they really are is excellent scenario generators. They encapsulate that which we know and that which we don't know. So number one, in terms, again, of sort of the sociology of these things or the anthropology, what I would prefer to do is to use the models that are already being used. Whatever models they use, and people say, oh, you're going to laugh, they're really, they're not very good and so on. No, they actually are very good. They just have been misapplied. To use those models to kind of get rid of the black box. I don't know this model. I don't trust this outcome and so on. Secondly, not only does this approach lend itself, but I think it's crucial to have engagement all throughout the process, not only with the planning staffs upon which the decision makers depend, but the decision makers themselves. Now, you put your finger on an important point, which is very often, this started 20 years ago, and this was heresy. And I'm talking about a guerrilla campaign that only now is really become mainstream. And you would get a lot of pushback from the analysts, inside this ministry or that department or this organization and so on. Why? Well, number one, this is very strange to them. This was not how they were taught. You do serious grown-up analysis. And number two, a little concerned about how they will look if somebody comes in and says, just do this. All of your guys couldn't figure this out, but we did. So I'm always very sensitive to that. And I always try very hard to make the support people look like heroes because I want to work with them. I want them to bring this, to their bosses. It's one thing. The other thing is that it's really interesting. When you talk to the bosses who are not trained analysts and so on, they say, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Because that's the way they think. They're sort of thinking in these terms. So number one, it doesn't necessarily require different models. It requires a different approach to models. Number two, you have to always pay attention to the not invented here syndrome. Number three, you will do a much better job and you will produce a much better result to the extent to which you will be working with people who are ultimately going to receive it. And I've seen this happen. At a certain point, all of a sudden, ownership is transferred. The people that are ultimately going to be the recipients go, okay, we see this now. So here's what we now need to do. We need to do this, 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 this. And you say, yeah, that's right, okay. So, you have to be sensitive to that. Now, it doesn't always work, but it is a profound mistake to think of any project of this type as just a problem of analysis or a technical problem that needs to be solved. You have to be very conscious of the human engineering as well. Your questions are very apt. I don't think there's any way of, just sort of waving your hand and getting rid of them. Just a lot of hard work and hopefully a little bit of luck. So, if there are no other questions, I guess we're getting close to the time that we needed to conclude. Matter of fact, we're precisely at that time. So again, let me thank you very much for listening to what I'm sure was a difficult talk on a rainy late afternoon. But I very much appreciate your attention. And with any sort of luck, we'll be able to maintain contact and perhaps discuss these matters further. So thank you. Thank you very much. Oh. Muchas gracias. Wonderful. Thank you. I thank you all.